Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Blevins, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Siemens Startup Podcast Series, where we speak to entrepreneurs to gain insight on how they turn their innovative dreams into successful companies. We're going to take a little bit of a turn on this particular podcast because we're not necessarily talking to a startup company, but we're talking to somebody who helps work with startup companies to get the startup company started. Over the years, I've had a pleasure of working with quite a few startup companies. Siemens has over 800 startup companies that have taken advantage of the Siemens Accelerator Startup Program in North America alone. I've learned a lot about startup companies over the 9 years that I have been working with them. And one thing sticks out to me, and that is that not all startups are the same. If you look at the definition from the Oxford Dictionary, it defines startup as a company in the first stages of operations. They are founded by one or more entrepreneurs who want to develop a product or service for which they believe there is demand. If you look at other definitions, a lot of them will point to technology disruptors. I personally believe that they are all correct. A lot of people create companies with a good idea or even great ideas, but lack the ability to launch the company for one reason or another. It could be a lack of funding or something as simple as knowledge of where to start. That's where groups, consortiums, and especially companies like the one our guest is a part of come in. Today I'm speaking with Avinash Prasad, Vice President of Hardware Catalyst at Venture Lab, a leading global founder community for hardware technology and enterprise software companies. Venture Lab is Canadian-based and is led by seasoned entrepreneurs and business leaders with decades of industry experience. I'm excited to learn more about Venture Lab, but first let's start with learning more about our guest. Hello, Avinash.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and your community.
Well, it's wonderful to speak with you as well, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. Can we start, Avinash, with learning more about you? Can you introduce yourself, tell us about your background, and what has brought you to where you are today?
My background is in engineering. I went to a program at University of Toronto called Engineering Sciences. It was one of the programs that they had in engineering, which was very broad-based. You touched upon multiple disciplines, which was great for a person who wasn't able to focus on any one discipline. But I gravitated towards software engineering as well as hardware engineering. Those were the two things that interested me the most. Following that, I started to work for a Canadian giant at the time called Nortel Networks. It went out of business around 2004 timeframe, which was a little bit of a tragedy for Canada. Subsequent to that, I worked at another giant of the time, Canadian giant, which was ATI, graphics processor development company, which was taken over around 2006 by AMD. And I continued to work with them. So my history has been with very, very large corporations. But subsequently to that, I did my own bit of a detour and started to work for semiconductor startups, the first being Fresco Microchip, and the second one being Spectra 7 Microsystems, and working from very large semiconductors to very, very small 2mm by 2mm semiconductors. So I had both the experience of working in large corporations that had large resources available to them, to ones that had very few resources available to them, and where the types of functions you had to accomplish within the company were multifaceted. You weren't able to just work in a small domain. You had to work in a larger scope within the startup. So I think that gave me the correct foundation to be able to help with startups, because I've been in both large and small companies and experienced firsthand what it's like to be in situations that startups often find themselves in.
You mentioned you worked for semiconductor startups. What role did you have at these companies, and how did that take you to Venture Lab?
I was largely responsible for operations in my previous startup company, Spectra 7 Microsystems. I happened to work for our CEO, Melissa Chi of Venture Lab. At the time, she had broader responsibilities, and I reported into her. So when she became CEO of Venture Lab and wanted to make a transformative change within the semiconductor industry within Canada and within Ontario in particular, she asked me to join her to head up what was being called, or what is called, Hardware Catalyst Initiative.
That's interesting. And so what really inspired you or drove you to go to Venture Lab?
When both Melissa, our CEO, and I were working at Spectra 7 Microsystems, we would very often complain about the lack of support for startup companies such as ours. And wouldn't it be great if this were available or that were available? Things that were costing us a lot internally, and lack of holistic support was making it much more challenging. Everything we were doing, essentially, we were starting from scratch. We were discovering things and finding opportunities ourselves. And very often that took us out of the local ecosystem to global opportunities, when in fact there were opportunities right in our local environment that we could have made access to, but our ecosystem wasn't very well knitted together. I continued to complain about that situation. Melissa, on the other hand, when she joined as CEO of Venture Lab, decided she was going to do something about that by raising the funds necessary to start this incubator, focused on semiconductors, sensors, and microelectronics. And once she was able to secure that funding, asked me to join her to head up that program and realize it and work towards making it a success.
That's great. And by the way, I think I read something in your background about you being an executive producer on a documentary, Cosmic Dance. Is that true?
Yes, that is correct.
So tell us about Cosmic Dance, if you would.
Sure. My cultural background, I have an ancestry with an Indian ethnic background. And at the time, they were putting together a museum of Indian civilization and the rich history and tapestry associated with that, and wanted to see if they could produce something that had both parallels within astrophysics as well as Hindu ancient philosophy. That story was told through a metaphor of dance, because that plays so much of a significant role within Indian culture. So my role within it was to make sure all production element worked correctly and we had the right resources to make it happen. I myself, despite all my best efforts, am not artistic. So
I just found it interesting, someone who's entrenched in engineering and then having that interest in the background as well. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. I'm an engineer by trade as well, and I have my own side things too, right? I guess is a way of putting it.
Well, we're problem solvers at heart, Kevin. So it's a different problem.
Yes, that's really interesting. Is that the only activity that you've had like that, or have you done more like that?
I've been involved with more things like that. One was a museum exhibition which dealt with the temples of India. And one of the things that's not very well understood is there's a myriad different faiths in India, the Sikh faith and the Muslim faith and the Hindu faith and the Jain faith and the Jewish faith. Everybody at one point or other has gravitated towards India. So there's so much architecture and rich culture there. It was sort of an exhibition to present those various faiths that have all had some presence at one time or another. And again, I was integrating these things and making it happen rather than having a steep knowledge within any one of these areas. One other thing I'll touch upon briefly was a project we did for Cadbury, which was bringing electrical capability to a village in Ghana where students would ride their bicycles for very long periods of time, and we'd harvest that energy into rechargeable light packs, which they could then use in the evenings to light up their rooms to do their homework. So it was a mini project there.
I find it interesting to see what people are doing outside of their professional careers. At this point, I'd like to talk a bit more about Venture Lab. I know it was founded in 2011. Can you tell us about how it got started?
Venture Lab was a little bit more broad in what it supported at its inception, and certainly didn't have a focus on hardware technologies. But from the very beginning, it was and still is a nonprofit organization. We don't take equity and we don't charge fees for the support that we offer. The focus, since Melissa, our CEO, took over, is around two main areas, not exclusively, but almost exclusively, around enterprise software companies and hardware technology companies. And I head up on the hardware technology side. So our focus is on semiconductor, sensor technologies, and microelectronics. It's a very broad scope, but in the ecosystem of incubators, it's the only one in Canada and possibly North America which provides the support we do to hardware startups without taking equity or charging fees. That's our two key areas of focus. And gratifyingly, we've seen some significant traction in companies looking for our support.
That's outstanding. And I'm sure that those companies appreciate you not taking stock, right? Or charging fees. That's very helpful.
It also gives them confidence, Kevin, that the guidance we provide is without any bias or slant towards certain situations. So we're not pushing them to get capital at the wrong time or on the wrong terms or anything like that.
I read a couple of definitions for startup. Does Venture Lab have a definition for startups as well?
I don't think we could do better than the ones you provided, Kevin. When you were saying them, like you, I thought there was an element of exactly what a startup is at any given moment in time.
So would Venture Lab be considered a nonprofit?
It is a nonprofit organization. It was started as a nonprofit and remains so.
That's wonderful. So Avinash, where is Venture Lab located?
Venture Lab is located in Markham, which is in the region of York, situated just north of Toronto. Toronto being the largest technology hub across Canada, and York region being the second largest hub. York region, and Markham in particular, has quite a few semiconductor companies in there, the most significant being AMD. And we're able to work in the midst of semiconductor companies in the region.
Great. That's a logical fit for being where you are today. In the introduction, I described Venture Lab as being a leading global founder community. What is a founder community?
Well, these are CEOs and executives within the startup companies that work with us, but also work with each other. One of the opportunities that we have in the space that we're in is sometimes to connect various people to each other. We find opportunities for some companies to collaborate with each other because they're developing solutions that are either adjacent or complementary to what the other company is doing. We try to integrate those companies together also with our partner ecosystem. So sometimes they're looking for support to solve some problem that they have or to build some prototype that they're looking for. And we're able to work with our partner companies to work with our startup companies to resolve those problems. And we like to think ourselves as not just focus on, let's say, the technology piece or some specific problem area. We like to look at it holistically, where we can complement the companies that are in our program with support opportunities that they themselves may not have the ability to access.
Well, I suspect that adds a tremendous amount of value to those startup companies being able to work with one another. Can you speak to the global aspects of Venture Lab?
I know people are very often not keen on too many statistics, but I'll just mention two. One is semiconductors underpin a $7 trillion economy globally. It's of massive importance. So if you look at the semiconductors as the engine of the global economy in large part, you can almost assess its impact from the lack of semiconductors, where automobile production lines had to be shut down. You looked during the pandemic and ventilators were getting stuck because semiconductors were not available to get integrated into them. You then realize the critical nature of this sector to the overall economy. It's not something that's nice to get involved in. It's something that's critical to get involved in. And Venture Lab has a unique role in helping enable that kind of ecosystem. One, in the startup community we're able to foster, but also the medium enterprises that we help to scale, and also the larger partner ecosystem that wants tighter integration and being able to leverage what they're able to offer in a bigger community. So in a manner of speaking, it's a rising tide that will raise all ships in the ecosystem. We're looking to provide a foundation for all of those things to happen.
I agree with your comment. It's more than just nice to get involved with semiconductors. It's critical. I believe a large share of microchips come out of Taiwan. Is that correct?
That is correct. As you may see in the cost of putting down foundries, it could be anywhere from $10 billion to $45 billion, depending on what kind of foundry you're looking to put down. Taiwan didn't grow its semiconductor fabrication ecosystem overnight. This was done in the middle 1980s to now, and they're reaping the benefit of that investment. And about 65% of all semiconductor fabrication comes out of Taiwan alone, which is a substantial production. And I should say that's consumer type semiconductors. If we look at that situation, it's great for Taiwan, but for a risk perspective, from a diversity of supply chain perspective, it's a challenge. And you can see that there's an opportunity there to put more diversity into the supply chain. That, I think, is something that's critically necessary for global security.
You make a great point about the criticality of global security. Considering everything happening in Taiwan today, what changes would you suggest may occur in the semiconductor industry in the future?
I think, like anything else, a crisis focuses the attention. And we've seen both in Europe and south of the border in the US, south of the border from us, obviously, we've seen major government investment. And in Canada, we are also seeing major government attention to investing in this sector. So right around the world, countries are seeing this as critical area to invest in and recognize that it requires significant incentives to create the environment where the manufacturing segment of semiconductor production can be repatriated to their countries. I don't ever see a situation where it's completely divested of Asia or Taiwan in particular. I just see more diversification, which I think is a healthy thing. We've seen Samsung recently announce $230 billion of investment in a semiconductor park, be a major park. But you can see that level of investment that's being done, both needed and supported by their regional governments.
Your website talks about an organization led by industry experts. Can you give some examples or an example related to some of these experts and how they help companies that would be with VentureLab?
Certainly. The heart of what we do is based on the experience and expertise of the advisors we have within our programs. And we make exceptional efforts to find the best and brightest in these areas. My colleagues include people who have been in the photonics industry, have been in the semiconductor industry, have been in the microelectronics build area. But we also have two additional focus areas in what we do. One is in medical device technologies development, and we have advisors who understand that industry, not only in Canada, but in the US, in Asia, and in Europe. So there's both unique domain expertise, but also overlap in expertise. So depending on what's being done, there's a good chance that the advisors we have in the medtech development will have the insights and guidance and expertise and connections that could help in that area. We recently announced in December of last year our automobility sector through what was called the OVIN program, which is the Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network. And we are the representative for the Toronto RTDS and Regional Technology Development Site. We are just building out expertise in that area and brought on board, I'm happy to say, an expert with many, many years of experience in the partner network and that ecosystem and what's needed to be successful in that domain. Because just as in the medical technology sector, it is similar in the automotive sector. These are not always consumer type opportunities. Sometimes there's standards that you have to meet, which are beyond consumer standards. Their qualification and characterization requirements, quality management systems that you have to put in place to be successful in those domains. So having the right expertise, having the right network connections can help our startups in these areas.
I think this mentoring has to be just invaluable to these companies, these startup companies. I think it's amazing what you're doing there. When you talk about startups versus scale-ups, can you tell me how you define the difference between the two?
almost without exception, every scale up started as a startup themselves. What we also look at when we're looking at some of these companies, we're also looking at what their market opportunity is, what their potential is to become the giants of the future. ATI, which was acquired by AMD, started out as a garage operation with around 4 engineers working on that opportunity and became a multi-billion-dollar corporation in its own right. So we look for those opportunities. We don't exclusively look at that. We don't turn, well, you're not going to be a multi-billion-dollar company, so we're not supporting you. That's not what it is. But we are also looking for the opportunities that some startup companies have to grow substantially. And sometimes it's the case that we're seeing for the startup companies opportunities that they themselves don't necessarily see. So sometimes we tell them, you know what, if you take this approach, you look at this market, you look at an opportunity or a partnership or a collaboration that you hadn't considered before, there's an opportunity here for you to dramatically expand your market reach.
The knowledge the team brings and the mentoring is really key. How many startups are engaged with Venture Lab?
Well, we've worked with about 3,500 companies through the history of Venture Lab. In the Hardware Catalyst Initiative program itself, it's about 51 companies presently, and we're actually onboarding another cohort of companies. So we'll have to see how many of those qualify into our program. Our program lasts 2 years, so it's not a superficial engagement. It lasts a relatively long period of time because hardware is hard, and we need to engage with them over a period of time to ensure that we get an in-depth understanding of where they wish to go. We understand where we can bring them over the course of their engagement with us and lay out the path to get there. So the Hardware Catalyst Initiative program proper is about 51 companies.
The 2 years, everybody uses that 2 years as a guide to how long they're going to be in that program.
Yeah, the program is actually 18 months to 2 years, but I've yet to encounter a company that didn't take advantage of the full 2 years.
When it comes to vetting the companies that are coming into Venture Lab, is there a particular process that you use for vetting?
Yeah, it's quite extensive. We have people with multidisciplinary backgrounds get involved in that screening process. Some people will be on the screening process where they have technology backgrounds. Some are involved where they have IP backgrounds. Some are involved where they have the investment side background. So we have people coming from different points of view, asking questions, looking to get different pieces of information out of that. And then once they get through that process, then we have what's called a boot camp. It's a 2-month period of the program where they're exposed to things like investment strategy, looking at their IP strategy, looking at their product development plans, and they have a bit of homework through that period of time. And it works both ways. One, we get to know them much better, but also they get to know us much better. It's at the end of that 2-month period, we're locked in. Okay, we're good to go. We know what you're dealing with and what we're dealing with. And it's an opportunity. Most of these startup companies spend most of their time with anybody on the outside of their companies, pitching and presenting their best sides. And then once we start the bootcamp process, we're telling them, yeah, we know you're great. We don't need to know that piece anymore. We need to know what the challenges are, which tends to be a little bit contrary to how they would approach things, where they're always putting forward their best side. We're now saying, you've pitched us your best side. We're convinced. Now we want to know what the challenges are that you're facing, so we know how we're going to be helping you over the next 2 years of the engagement.
So you mentioned that Venture Lab is located in Ontario. Are most of the companies or all of the companies from Canada that you work with?
Yes, indeed. Either they have a significant presence in Ontario if they're outside of the province, or they're located in Ontario. That's because the large portion of our funding comes from various levels of government in Canada, from the municipal, regional, provincial, and federal, supporting what we're doing. And although we're nonprofit, although we don't take equity or charge fees, we're actually looking for a return on our investment. But that is in the GDP, that's in the jobs created, that's in the IP created in the region. So those are the types of returns we're looking for in terms of the investment made.
So Avinash, you're using the Siemens software. Can you tell us why you've chosen to partner with Siemens?
I suppose as an engineer, both an engineer by profession and also in spirit, I love working with Siemens, a company that's had such incredibly long history. I'm yet to meet the person within Siemens who can tell me what Siemens does in its entirety. It's such an amazing company. You can ride a high-speed train and you're using a Siemens product. You could pick up the phone and it can be a Siemens product. So it's great to work with a company like that, but it yet at the same time has a very entrepreneurial spirit itself. In fact, tomorrow we have a Siemens team coming on site to visit us at Venture Lab, and we're thrilled to have them on board. Right now, we work with a couple of products, not the only products, but a couple of products that work quite well amongst our portfolio. One is the product lifecycle management software, PLM, and also Solid Edge, which has some amazing design capabilities in it and simulation as well. So you can do board designs in there, but also characterize and simulate how it's going to behave. So those are two products that we look to very often with Siemens, but there's a myriad different things that we reach out to, both in the life sciences sector and the automobility sector, and also the power delivery sector.
Well, I'm going to be honest. I don't know everything about Siemens, and I know a ton, but what amazes me about Siemens is our ability to integrate not only software, but the hardware. So if you're designing a plant, you're building a plant, designing a product, building that product, being able to simulate everything, it's the reason I've been with this company as long as I have been with this company. We were talking about your facility earlier. Can you share more about your lab?
I'm very happy to talk about our lab infrastructure. We were speaking about having worked in a startup, and one of the key things I would have loved to have had available to me is the lab infrastructure that we can now provide at no cost to hardware catalyst companies. We have a test and measurement lab. It has what you would expect to find in there: oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, digital power sources. But we have more esoteric pieces of equipment like battery drain testers, RF sniffers, vector network analyzers, and things of that sort. We even have a wafer probe station. We also have environmental test capability like EMI, EMC testing that you can do, RF enclosure. We have shock and vibration tables, thermal chambers. We also have server infrastructure to support. So if you're working with design tools that require significant horsepower, you can use those servers to run those programs. So we average between $2 to $3 million at least that we can take away from a startup company's cost base because of this lab infrastructure that we can provide. In turn, we're looking for those startup companies to invest in the talent they need to realize the product they're developing. We also recently, that is about 2 weeks ago, opened up a medical technologies lab, which is more focused on life sciences, microelectronics intersection to support startup companies in the medtech domain.
Once a company is working with Venture Lab, what can they expect from an experience perspective in the first 3 to 6 months?
One of the things that we absolutely need to do is to understand where they're at. We need to understand what their IP strategy is, what their product development strategy is, what their market opportunity is. We need to know what qualifications, clinical trials, what certifications they need. We need to understand quite holistically what they need to be aware of. Very often with startup companies, they tend to be a bit focused on what they're really good at, and very often that's on their core technology development. And like anything else, you tend to gravitate to what you're most comfortable with. But given that most startups have very small teams, there are a lot of things that they need to be aware of, and they're not because members of their team tend to be more drawn towards the design side of things. So some of the business elements, some of the IP strategy, some of the capital raise, some of these other supply chain areas, for example, some of these other areas don't necessarily get the attention they deserve. And then going down the development path, not having paid any attention to these areas, sometimes can be a major stumbling block to get to market. So we can, in a sense, be an extension of those startups teams to help them in those areas. So that's in the first part of the engagement. It's very much trying to discover those areas and making sure that we have some kind of way to address those areas.
So it's finding out what they're doing now, where they're at, and how to move them forward then.
One of the things that we try to ensure that all of our programs, not just Hardware Catalyst Initiative, but whether it be the capital investment program that we have or our Accelerate AI program that we have, we try to maintain a focused attention on ensuring that underrepresented founders are integrated into our programs. We like to say that the inclusivity is not appended onto our programs, it's integrated within our programs.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. And you mentioned capital investment, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask your opinion related to the Silicon Valley Bank issue that we're seeing today. And I guess it's not the only bank, but the Silicon Valley Bank is tied to many of the startups out there from the U.S. perspective. So I'd love to get your opinion on what you think is going to happen.
I think, like anything else, an investment bank like the Silicon Valley Bank going into the situation that they found themselves is going to make investors somewhat skittish. I think ultimately that's going to be a short-term situation. The growth trajectory of semiconductors is on an amazing upward path of development. But in the short term, there's no question that it's going to make investors in this area think twice about whether this is a rational bet or not. But I think that's a short-term situation, and we need to work through those circumstances. A lot of the startup companies in our domain are not tied up with Silicon Valley Bank. But there's a broader challenge for hardware companies and investment in hardware companies. One of the things that the Silicon Valley has is a lot more savvy hardware investors. It's challenged at the best of times to raise funds. It's an even more of a challenge to get investment into hardware technology companies. Sometimes the technology is so esoteric, so unique, and you're looking at startup companies that are looking to break the paradigms. They're looking to go into an area not there before. So not only are you looking for an investor to understand the domain, you're looking for them to understand the disruptive element of that startup company. One of the things we're looking to do going forward is to try to nurture and develop the hardware investor community to support the startups that are coming along.
My comment to a number of the partners that we're working with is that this isn't the only investment bank out there, right? There's a number of them out there. This is one of quite a few. So you've been working with startup companies for close to 4 years. What advice or words of wisdom would you offer a budding entrepreneur or people thinking about starting a company or working for a startup?
What I would say very early on, it's in our experience, it's very difficult for an individual to be successful in a startup company. It's very important to build a team. We correlate success very often to strong development teams. So having a team of people in your organization that you can rely on, that can give you critical feedback, constructive feedback, not only challenge what you might be putting forward, but also offering suggestions is invaluable. Because if you're thinking of this on your own, you can sometimes only see challenges and not solutions, or sometimes you're looking too positively on something and not critically looking at the problem. So having a strong team along with you is very, very critical, very, very early on. And I would say, look for the help that organizations such as ours can provide. We've got decades of experience, meaningful experience. And why on earth would you want to go through the pitfalls that we've already gone through? Why relearn the lessons the hard way that we've already been through? We're willing to share it with you. We're willing to tell you how you can avoid it and how you can be successful by maybe looking at things somewhat differently. So when I speak to the other hardware advisors on the team, one thing rings true is their passion for the companies they support. I think sometimes the startups might be surprised at how vigorously they're represented during our reviews.
That's amazing. We're coming to the end of our time today. Before we go, do you have thoughts or comments that you would like to share with the audience related to Venture Lab?
What I would suggest, maybe there are members of your audience whose curiosity is piqued somewhat by what we've discussed. Please feel free to reach out to us and ask us. We're always happy to engage. It's a very dynamic, growing ecosystem that we have. I'd also send a message to people who may be in the thinking about an engineering career. If they're looking to do that, think about one in microelectronics. It's an amazing sector. There's tremendous growth ahead of it. And I think there are wonderful opportunities there.
I would like to thank you today for joining this conversation, Avinash. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I've enjoyed learning more about how Venture Lab works with startup companies and how you and others are working so hard to help all of these entrepreneurs be successful. I think the mentoring that you're doing is just completely invaluable. And I'm sure they are grateful for all that you do. And so am I. I appreciate that because you lead companies our way. So I appreciate that. I believe that the entrepreneurs of today are leaders for our industry tomorrows. For our listeners, if you want to learn more about Venture Lab and the incredible environment that they've created for hardware startups and scale-ups, you can go to their website, www.venturelab.ca. I'd also like to thank everyone for listening to the podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with another amazing company that's working in the startup industry and helping startups to become incredible companies. As a reminder, Siemens does offer special packaging and pricing for small to medium-sized startup companies on nearly all areas of our software portfolio. If you'd like to know more about this, please visit Siemens' website at www.siemens.com/software for startups, or speak with myself or any of the Siemens partners out there. Please feel free to provide comments on this episode by leaving a review on your favorite podcast site, or feel free to email me at kevin.blevins@siemens.com. This is your host, Kevin Blevins. Remember, innovation has no boundaries.